When we think of Vikings, the very first term that springs to mind is cruel. So it's difficult to believe that there was a law and order framework back then that would punish those in the Viking community who didn't follow the rules. You won't believe it, but their forms of punishment were very severe. Some of the forms of punishment they had back then would have shaken. If you want to learn more about what punishment was like for Vikings, then let's get started. Before that, we want to say hello and welcome you to Uncovering Myth channel. If you want to see more historic and mythic videos like this, please subscribe to our channel before we move forward. To begin with, Vikings were indeed dark and vicious individuals who attacked and conquered large areas of Europe. The origins of the Vikings can be traced back to Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. They began as a tiny group living in caves with their family members. The appearance of Viking longships coming up over the horizon terrified surrounding countries from generation to generation. They were renowned rebels recognized for their viciousness and barbarity. Even the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople hired them in his prestigious Varangian Guard. Even a century later, they were acknowledged for their talent for mass killing and bravery in battle. If you go back in time, you can read about how Vikings assassinated infant girls, raped and crushed enemies to embarrass them, and slaughtered animals and humans. Some of these tales will leave you with goosebumps. It's difficult to imagine the Vikings, who are recognized for murder, loot, and pillage almost all of Europe without morals, having a legal system. Can you imagine? But while their actions were fierce, their justice was even more harsh and bloodstained. You might think of Vikings as lawbreakers, which is a reasonable guess given what they did, but they were also legislators who respected the judiciary. In a meeting known as a thing, all three Viking men would assemble in their communities to create laws and adjudicate. Each neighborhood had its own thing. The thing used to get together regularly to resolve duels and family rivalries. This is also known as a small family court. The thing was mostly in the hands of powerful families. So the more power you had back then, the more likely it was that your judgment would be accepted. So, what happened to those found guilty in such meetings? Can you guess? Many incidents were resolved through arbitrary proceedings, financial penalties, or simply being ordered to leave the settlement and end up living in the wilds, known as outlawry. It wasn't great for the criminal's health and allowed any civilian to kill him or her on sight. In other ways, their legal retribution techniques were bloodthirsty and cruel, but also imaginative at times. In order of severity, here are 6 of the most heinous and unbelievable Viking punishments, starting with caught red-handed ordeal by fire. The darkly named ordeal was a punishment strategy in later Viking times that expanded alongside Scandinavia's acceptance of Christianity. It could be a sinking, eating, or fire test. So, if an inmate survived the punishment, it was assumed that God had found them to be innocent and decided to intervene to save those. If the ordeal ended in death, the prisoner was subjected to some form of excruciatingly traumatic heat exposure during the ordeal by fire. They may be instructed to dip their hand into a pot of boiling water or oil, walk all over hot coals, or hold a red-hot iron for a set length of time. How vicious was this? Now it's time for the second one. Holy cow, the Viking Rodeo. What kind of legal repercussions could you have predicted if you were an early medieval Norseman and then someone disrespected your wife? Of course, the prosecution is in your hands. A duel, known as a holmgang, was a popular way of formal dispute settlement. So, a man in a duel in Sweden and Denmark did not always possess the option of quietly surrendering or losing by splattering his blood first and stepping away. Often, his opponent would want lethal justice regardless. But there was only one way for the scumbag to escape with his life, and that is a cow rodeo. A cow was wheeled into the venue where the battle had just ended. Its tail would have been shaved and greased after that. The man's boots were also extensively greased, and the cow was brutally beaten and teased to enrage it. The rodeo started when the driver pulled on the cow's tail, causing it to charge around and stomp like a firecracker. If the man could indeed hold onto the cow's tail for a certain amount of time, he has met the requirements and permitted to live. He was also permitted to keep the cow as an additional bonus. He's a lucky person. But what do you think? Is he a lucky person or not? Now the next one is how enthralling. Slavery. Slaves, also known as thralls, have been either hostage taken in battle, domestic lawbreakers, or those wanting to work off the debt in Viking lands. They were vital necessities for the Viking economic system. Slavery was also frequently used as a punishment for a range of different Viking domestic offenses. A woman found guilty of theft, for instance, could have been compelled to be the victim's thrall. Being a Viking and being subjected to slavery for a debt or crime was a severe penalty. Thralls had almost no rights, and their masters could beat and harass them without consequence. If a male thrall declined to work for his lender and no alternative remedy was discovered at the thing, the boss was allowed to either maim or kill the thrall on his upper or lower body. Thralls would generally live alongside domesticated animals and farm animals. Many slaves who continued to serve high-born masters faced seemingly unending punishment. Their masters required someone to wait for them in the hereafter, so they frequently had 1 or 2 slaves buried with them. One Viking Eastern European tradition was for an elderly woman, renowned as the Angel of Death, to murder the master's slave girls. A couple of men would choke their girl while the other woman pressed a blade into her heart at the burial site. The victim was therefore taken to be buried with her boss. How pathetic and cruel is this? Can't even imagine, guys. The fourth one is downtime, tarring and feathering. A man stealing on trading journeys was subjected to tarring and feathering under Sweden's Bajarki laws, which some experts agree on dating back to 832. So, what did they do to the criminal? His head was completely hairless and covered in tar before being adorned with duck feathers. The remaining traders then formed 2 lengthy line segments facing inwards. The poor man, covered in feathers, was made to run between the men who were throwing stones and concrete blocks at him. Anyone who did not throw an item at the feathered guy was penalized. If the thief survived the challenge without dying, he received no further sentence. We can't even imagine the scenario. Here we go again. Amputation. Did you know that punishment in Viking communities was frequently based on social status? Thralls were penalized more harsher than free men. If a thrall committed a burglary at the command of their boss, the boss was penalized instead. As a method of extreme punishment, different forms of disfigurement were used from time to time and from one place to another. Canute, the illustrious Danish king of England from 1016 to 1035, implemented a bleak law that perished with him. It stated that if a woman committed adultery, she would lose her nose and ears, whereas men would only be discouraged. The Grey Goose laws of early medieval Iceland stated that a thrall who murdered their maestro and then attempted to flee would have both their legs and arms severed. They were permitted to live, and they spent the remainder of their lives crawling around everywhere, serving as a moving alarm to others. Lastly, we have the cruelest one. A real rib tickler, the blood eagle. Maybe this is the most vicious one. So, if an offense was severe enough just to merit the death sentence among Vikings, the perpetrator would almost certainly be beheaded. One particularly brutal Viking means of execution is iconic, claiming that it is a distinctively bloody form of desire for revenge reserved by sons on their father's killers. This is the terrible blood eagle, also known as the blood red eagle. In 867, Ivar the Boneless was said to have given La, king of Northumbria, the blood eagle punishment in reputation for the execution of Ivar's father, Ragnar Lodbrok. To create an aquiline structure, the convicted man's back would be sliced open, then his ribs sheared and pulled out. The murdered man's son would then start tearing out the lungs with his own hands through the bloodied eagle-shaped ribs. Based on some mythic portrayals, the victim was lifted while suspended between 2 trees by his hands. The backskin would be drawn to the sides to depict the pair of wings. This video, we hope, will teach you about the punishment of Vikings. Please leave any comments or suggestions for future videos in the comments section below.